Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear from Steven McGregor, a former Army infantry officer who has seen the light and turned his attention to naval history after his stint in the Army. McGregor speaks at the University of Texas, Austin about his first book, The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway. 2022 marked the 50th anniversary of the battle, and there were many celebrations which highlighted the contributions of intelligence as well as the sacrifice of the TBD Devastator pilots of VT-8, who lost every aircraft that flew against the Japanese that day. But McGregor tells a slightly different story, focusing on a different aircraft, the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, as well as the story of three immigrants: Heineman, the designer of the SBD Dauntless; Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet; and Kleiss, a pilot in one of the attack squadrons. This story weaves together a tale of ingenuity, bravery, peacetime readiness, and American innovation in a way that helps to shed a different light on the battle. This is a fascinating story of an epic naval struggle and one that shaped the future of power projection and naval dominance for at least a century to come. Let's listen in.
It's just a great pleasure to come talk about the book, Midway, the Battle of Midway. It's an iconic battle. So there's a lot we can learn from it. If you think about when it takes place, the Japanese, they had run riot across the Pacific after Pearl Harbor once Pearl Harbor happens in December 1941. In the next 5 months, the Japanese they have an incredible amount of military success. They capture Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and are well on their way toward finishing off the capture of the Philippines. And then on the 4th of June, 1942, off Midway Island, the U.S. Navy ambushed the Japanese striking force, the Kido Butai, and sunk all 4 of its carriers. The Japanese advance stalled, and her navy never really recovered. Well, this dramatic and unexpected reversal, it's often been attributed to mere luck, even divine intervention. Walter Lord, his book Incredible Victory, published in 1967, he said of the Americans, they had no right to win. In the famous 1976 Hollywood film, the Nimitz character, played by Henry Fonda, he asks at the end, were we better than the Japanese or just luckier? And one book by Gordon Prang, it was entitled Miracle at Midway. That came out in 1977. Well, in our new book, The Silver Waterfall, How America Won the War in the Pacific at Midway, my co-author Brendan Sims and I push back against this view. We stress the importance of skill and training, showing how the pre-war U.S. Navy developed a deadly dive bomber weapon which came into its own in 5 legendary minutes. And we embed our account in a much wider story about American innovation and a related subplot about migration. The first 3 chapters of the book concern Ed Heineman. He's one of the he's on the top left, those 3 photos there. Ed Heineman, he's the designer of the battle-winning weapon, the Dauntless dive bomber. Chester Nimitz, he's on the top right. He drew up the American plan at Midway. He was the strategist behind the victory. And Dusty Kleiss, he's one of the most accurate pilots on the day. He's there in the center there on the bottom. And all 3 of these men, they were German Americans. The core of the book is 3 narrative and strictly sequential chapters. So we start off with 3 chapters talking about these 3 individuals, and then we move into 3 narrative and sequential chapters. One deals with the approach flight of the dive bombers. The next offers the most detailed description of their attack, which one observer described as a beautiful silver waterfall, from which the book takes its title. He saw the sun glinting off the wings of the dive bombers as they came down. And the following chapter describes the traumatic aftermath of the attack as the Japanese struggle to save their stricken carriers. We also make a broader point about Midway's importance in World War II. The war is usually seen as a case of initial professional incompetence, which is then later redeemed by mass mobilization and amateur genius. That tends to be how we conceptualize of the war. But what's striking about our story, the Battle of Midway, is that it's actually a battle which is won by the peacetime Navy. Every carrier that served at Midway on the U.S. side, and the Japanese as well, it was commissioned long before the war began. And every pilot who scored a hit on a Japanese carrier in the battle, he earned his wings before Pearl Harbor. We then conclude the book with an argument about what all this means today, as the Pacific is once more a site of furious contestation, this time between the United States and the People's Republic of China. The PRC Navy is now, by some reckonings, larger than the U.S., and there's also been a shift in the balance of missile technology. So in our view, peacetime preparation is essential, because if we do suffer another Pearl Harbor, it will be crucial for us to earn another Midway. Well, in the beginning was the plane. The Dauntless was central to the U.S. victory at Midway. It was designed by Edward Heineman, who, along with many other German Americans, emerged from the frenetic startup culture of the early aviation industry in California. Heineman designs his first aircraft at the age of 21. He never goes to university, just wanted to design airplanes. Designs his first aircraft at the age of 21, and 5 years later enters a competition to produce a dive bomber. He's working for Douglas Aircraft. At the time, the Navy puts out a call for a new dive bomber, and he submits a design which later becomes the SBD. And he recalls the specifications that were put out by the Navy, which were the following. The plane had to take off from a pitched carrier deck with a full load of fuel and a 1,000-pound bomb, and be capable of performing a stable, vertical, zero-lift dive at an airspeed of less than 250 knots. The dive would be initiated at about 20,000 feet and maintained until the bomb release point of 3,000 feet, at which point the pilot would immediately recover. The airplane also had to be capable of completing this maneuver even if the bomb was not released. Aside from these guidelines, which largely involved the strength and load-bearing abilities of the aircraft, there were two further requirements. First, the plane needed to use a special crutch to deliver the bomb. In flight, it held the bomb against the fuselage, but upon release, it swung down, releasing the bomb beyond the blades of the propeller. And second, the plane needed to adhere to certain dimensions. In order to fit inside the elevator used to transport planes from the hangar deck to the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, a plane's wingspan needed to be less than 42 feet in length. And I've got a video here of, this is just a picture of what one of the design studios looked like in the 1920s when Heineman would have first learned to become an engineer and sort of started his career. So just to give you an idea of kind of how much trial and error was taking place and what everything looked like. You know, there's not too many digital machines in that design studio. Well, this here is, let's see if this works. This is a video of dive bombing.
We must figure out how many feet the target will move forward while the bomb is falling. Then we must aim that distance ahead of the target center so that the target and the bomb will meet. Let's try again. This time we'll aim ahead of the target. We release the bomb. And bang! We score a direct hit. There's nothing haphazard about dive bombing. After the basic principles are understood, the rest is the practice that makes perfect. Maybe we won't put all the shots down the stack, but we can put them where they count.
That's helpful. You see, you get an idea there of how the bomb is delivered. The plane has to fly directly down toward the target and then release its ordnance. And in order to perform this maneuver accurately, it's helpful if you can slow the plane's descent. And that is what you see here in this picture. This is something that Heineman designed. One of his innovations, one of the things that he created to make the Dauntless such an effective plane. They were called split flaps on the trailing edge of the wings. And when they open, they slow the descent of the plane. The dive, it becomes slow and steady in the dive. Even though it's plunging down toward the sea or its target, the earth, it's slow and steady in the dive. It was discovered, however, that when Heineman first installed these on the prototype, that when the split flaps were extended, the tail of the plane fluttered violently. Riding along in the plane, Heineman, he would often ride in the back seat where the gunner eventually would be placed, and he would ride there so he could observe how his design was performing. And riding there, he looks out the window and he sees the tail warping by as much as 2 feet, which he said scared the very hell out of me. That's what he told his biographer. So it was quite frightening for him to actually be in the plane and watch the tail moving about wildly as they're zooming towards the Earth. Well, what happened was the flaps were creating vortexes that disrupted the plane's lateral stability. Minor adjustments did not solve the problem. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, what later becomes NASA, they sent out an aerodynamic engineer, Charles Helm, to help sort of figure out what's going on. And he suggested drilling a series of holes in the flaps to ease the flow of air over the surface. As Heineman complained, this made the aircraft, when its split flaps were opened, look like a flying colander. But it did the trick. The plane was now capable of stable vertical dives without exceeding 250 knots. Heineman had nearly perfected his Dauntless dive bomber. The next major character in our story is Chester Nimitz. Born of staunch German stock in the Texas Hill Country in Fredericksburg, he enters the U.S. Naval Academy in 1901 and graduates in 1905. After service in the surface fleet, and then in submarines, he entered the Naval War College in 1922. And here he learned about a new technique of using the aircraft carrier as the capital ship of a formation. Previously, the battleship was the capital ship. It was the ship that all other ships supported. But some strategists proposed that the aircraft carrier should assume this role, sailing at the center of a circular formation, a larger formation of other ships like destroyers and cruisers. And when Nimitz was promoted to become the XO of Battle Fleet on the West Coast, it's in 1923, so he's the Naval War College in 1922. He hears about this idea that the aircraft carrier is going to become the new capital ship, the new essential ship in your formation. Well, then the following year, he becomes XO of Battle Fleet in the West Coast. He implements this idea. He innovates. He uses this new idea, and he makes his carriers the capital ships of their formations. After Pearl Harbor, so the attack on Pearl Harbor takes place in December of 1941, Nimitz is made commander of the Pacific Fleet. Most of the battle fleet is at the bottom of the harbor, but he still has the carriers which escaped unscathed. And Nimitz then launches raids to unsettle the Japanese. If you just name a few of them. On February 1st, there's an attack on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. You can see them depicted there in the round about the bottom left. So on February 1st, an attack on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. 3 weeks later, there's an attack on Wake Island. And on March 4th, there's an attack on Marcus Island. Finally, on March 10th, there's an attack on Japanese shipping near the towns of Leh and Salamaua on New Guinea Island. So Nimitz goes on the offense, and he's conducting these island raids using his carriers. They're maneuverable enough, they're flexible enough to do these missions, and that's his response after he comes in to assume command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, under Admiral Yamamoto, they react by planning to lure the U.S. carriers into an ambush at Midway Atoll. Because of U.S. signals intelligence, Nimitz learns of this plan from his intelligence officers, and he decides to set a trap of his own. Well, Nimitz strengthens Midway Atoll. He deploys more aircraft there, and he dispatches 2 carrier task forces, Task Force 16 with the Enterprise and the Hornet, and Task Force 17 with the Yorktown, to lie in wait for the Japanese just to the northwest of Midway itself. Well, just for a moment here, it's worthwhile to say something about these aircraft carriers. In 1936, the U.S. Navy had launched the Yorktown, the first of a new class of aircraft carrier, 809 feet in length. It was home to some 2,000 souls, and it was essentially, you could think of it as a floating city. Its most precious cargo were aircraft. At the Battle of Midway, it held 27 fighters, 37 dive bombers, and 15 torpedo bombers, a total of 79 planes. There were 78 on the Enterprise and 77 on the Hornet. The Imperial Japanese Navy, they employ a similar approach to naval warfare. Carriers, their carriers, They deployed 3 types of planes as well. They also had dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. However, there were several differences between the U.S. and the Japanese Navy. For instance, Japanese scouts, they were float planes that were deployed from supporting ships. This made them, in an organizational sense, less important than other tactical roles, something that hampered their offensive capability. So in fact, in the U.S. Navy, the Dauntless dive bomber was used as the American scouting plane. So the same plane that could perform the most important offensive maneuver for the U.S. Navy was also used as our scout, whereas the Japanese had separate planes for this. So there were some differences that came about tactically between the 2 fleets because of this. Well, another difference between the U.S. and the Japanese is that the Japanese torpedo bomber was actually effective. Their torpedoes were far better than those of the U.S., and the Japanese also took a different tactical approach to naval warfare, as demonstrated by differences in their ships. The Kaga and the Akagi, 2 major Japanese carriers, they were converted battle cruisers and similar in size and speed to the Yorktown class. But later carriers, such as the Soryu and the Hiryu, they were laid down in 1934 and 1936, respectively. They were sleeker, faster, and lighter. The Hiryu was nearly 100 feet shorter, 40 feet thinner, and 5,000 tons lighter than the Yorktown. It also cruised 2 miles per hour faster. But the Hiryu also carried about 20 fewer aircraft and 1,000 fewer souls, and had an operational range that was 2,000 nautical miles shorter. Japanese carriers were designed for offensive strikes, whereas U.S. carriers were built more to function as one part of a larger, more comprehensive fleet of ships. And finally, another important difference is that Americans stored their planes in open hangars. You can see them pictured here. You can see how the American hangar decks, they were able to open these enormous decks for ventilation, and they could use it for all different purposes. But the fact is, they could actually open their hangar decks on the side of the ship. And the Japanese, by contrast, their decks were completely sealed, and they would store and prep their planes inside their sealed hangar decks. So the Americans, they would take the planes up onto the flight deck. They would load them with the ordnance on top of the plane on the flight deck, whereas the Japanese would load their ordnance down below. They would fuel and load their ordnance down below inside sealed hangar decks. We'll see why this is a factor, why this is important later on when we get to the Battle of Midway. Well, it's all very well to have these machines, these carriers and these planes, but you need people to pilot them. People who are well trained. And here's a picture of one. He's holding a beer. He's having a beer. This is important. This is an important research photo to get an understanding. The man there in his bathing suit is Dusty Kleiss. Okay, he's the third sort of major character in our story. His full name, Norman Jack Kleiss. He was born to a German-American family in Coffeyville, Kansas. He entered the Naval Academy in 1934 after a spell on big ships. He then becomes a dive bomber pilot with Scouting 6 on the USS Enterprise. After Pearl Harbor, he's investigated on account of his German background. And what's important is that Kleiss arrives at his squadron in the spring of 1941 in time to familiarize himself with Ed Heineman's plane. So he arrives there before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor takes place. Dive bombing meant, as one pilot put it, firing the bomb like a bullet rather than dropping it, just as we saw in that clip. The plane had to be pointed more or less at the target, allowing for wind and the movement of an enemy ship. So in the clip, the pilot was actually dropping his bomb on a stationary land target. But at sea, Kleiss would have to deliver his bomb often on what was a moving target. The enemy ship, the ship he was targeting, would actually be traveling at speed. So he'd have to calibrate for that in his approach. Well, Kleiss practiced this maneuver many times with his squadron, and most importantly, because he was aboard the Enterprise in the early months of the war, he performed his dives in combat as well. So those island raids that Nimitz launches immediately after he assumes command of the Pacific Fleet, Kleiss participates in those raids. So he's able to perform his dives in combat, which, I mean, is just an incredible amount you learn when you perform your skills in combat. that is probably when you're able to that's when you're able to learn the most. And so he's able to do that before he serves at the Battle of Midway. Well, here's a picture of some SBDs in flight. You can see the pilot in the front, the gunner in the back, and their formation. You can see those characteristic split flaps. They're closed at the moment, but you can see those holes. It becomes sort of like, something very, very characteristic, the silhouette for the SBD. And this plane in general, it commanded a strong sense of respect and affection from the pilots. It was, as Dick Best recalled, he's one of the other important pilots in the Battle of Midway, he recalled that that Heineman's plane, it was rock steady in a vertical dive. It was completely responsive to the controls and ready to absorb punishment and still get you home. Norman Van Divier, a member of Best's squadron on the Enterprise, he wrote home after watching a fellow pilot survive a crash, saying, "It's really wonderful what those planes will take and still protect the occupants." After several months at sea, he said, "Our planes are holding up very well in carrier operation." Max Leslie, he's commander of Bombing Squadron 3, then on the USS Saratoga, he spoke of the most perfect combination of ruggedness, stability, ease of maintenance, and combination of performance, speed, and endurance. "I love my SBD," Kleiss recalled. In 1942, the SBD replaced the battleship. "In my opinion," this is Kleiss speaking, "in my opinion, we owe everything to Edward Heineman's plane." And after surviving a dive in which the plane coped with incredible pressure without the wings coming off, Kleiss recalled thinking, "All honor to the folks at Douglas. They constructed their SBDs superbly." And for the engineers in the room, you'll notice, one of the things about the plane that makes it so strong is that low mono wing. So the wing runs right under the fuselage, and it does not fold. So Heineman made his wingspan short enough so the wings themselves would not have to fold, even though it had to fit inside very specific sort of area in the carrier hangars. So his wings were incredibly strong, and his fuselage is entirely made of metal. His wings and his fuselage is all metal. There's no fabric in the plane, and that as well makes the plane very, very, very rugged. It's able to endure a great amount of pressure when recovering from its dives, and also when it's under attack, when it's dogfighting, or if it takes any hits from enemy artillery. It's an incredibly strong design. Well, at 0200 on the 4th of June, Kleiss is woken up for breakfast of steak and eggs. He's aboard the USS Enterprise. 2 a.m. steak and eggs. I could do that right now. I'm so jet lagged. I could easily have had some steak and eggs this morning, but I was probably just about waking up myself, actually. He's on the USS Enterprise at the northeast corner of the map. Midway Atoll is just about 200 nautical miles south of him. And as the Americans discover at 5:20 that morning, the Japanese fleet with 4 carriers, you can see them there, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, the Japanese fleet is approaching from the northwest. Well, on the U.S. carriers, the aircraft are spotted. Once the order to launch has been given, the aircraft are spotted. That is, they're arranged and prepared on the deck by the maintenance crews. It's a kind of puzzle fitting. Some 60 planes are arranged at the tail end of the deck, wingtip to wingtip, so that the rest of the deck can be used for takeoff. Once the planes are parked, the maintenance men weaved around them, ensuring they're fully fueled and armed with required ordnance. Red-helmeted ordnance men, they would visit each plane in pairs. So there's one of the most vivid accounts of the Battle of Midway is written by an ordnance man himself, actually, and he talks about all the different colors of the uniforms, because depending on your job in the carrier, you would wear a different color vest, different color helmet, so that people could identify who you were. And the ordnance men had red helmets, and they would visit each plane in pairs with a special wagon. They moved the correct ordnance under each plane and then lifted it into place. Once it was fixed, they would insert the fuse into the nose of the bomb and then thread a long copper arming wire through the holes in the fuse vanes. Dauntlesses from scouting squadrons, they were issued a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage and 2 underwing 100-pound bombs. They're incendiaries. The rest were given a single 1,000-pound bomb. The larger bombs had delayed fuses and would detonate after penetrating their target. The smaller ones had contact fuses and would explode on impact. The torpedoes slung under the Devastators were also set to detonate on impact, although their detonators didn't really work, so that doesn't really matter so much. Devastator was a very dangerous plane. Well, now the planes are arranged on deck and armed and loaded, it was time for launch. The plane captain cranked up the inertia starter, which turned the engine and the propeller enough to start for the engine to start. And Kleiss fixed his goggles over his eyes. He glanced back at John Snowden, his gunner, and then settled into his seat. He listened as the engine found its rhythm. The noise, he remembered, it was like a chorus of 33 angry buzzsaws, and it was deafening. So all those planes are firing up on the deck, preparing to launch. Well, that morning, the Japanese attacked Midway for two reasons. First, to lure the American carriers into battle, and then second, to eliminate the threat of a shore-based attack on the Kido Butai. And Nagumo has planes ready for both purposes. He sends out a strike element to attack Midway Atoll, and he also keeps back a reserve element to protect his fleet. However, the attack on Midway Atoll fails to cause enough damage, and Nagumo receives word that a second strike is required. He orders his reserve aircraft aboard ship to prepare to carry out this task. Well, this gives rise to what Midway scholars have called Nagumo's dilemma. While his reserve aircraft are being rearmed, a Japanese scout sights the U.S. fleet, and Nagumo must decide, does he go ahead with his plan to hit Midway a second time, or does he rearm his reserve to hit the U.S. fleet? And if he sends a strike force to the U.S. ships, does he wait for the return of his initial strike? Nagumo decides that a coordinated strike on the American fleet is best, and he orders his planes rearmed with their original ordnance. Well, because of the short amount of time all this is taking place, all this different ordnance has been called, the ordnance is stored deep in the bottom of the ship, near the keel, and it's called up into the hangar deck to be loaded on the planes. But because time is so short, the ordnancemen don't have time to send the ordnance back down to the bottom of the ship. So it's all accumulating there inside these sealed hangar decks of the Kaga and the Akagi, along with fully fueled planes. So this is taking place in the Japanese ships as the Americans are flying on their way towards where they believe the Kido Butai is located. Well, by 10:20 that morning, Dusty Kleiss, he's one of 47 SBDs above the Japanese fleet, one of 47 Dauntless planes above the Japanese fleet. And Jimmy Thatch, a fighter pilot who's observing the attack, he as he sees the planes coming down, he says that those descending dive bombers looked like a beautiful silver waterfall. And when it's Kleiss's turn to dive, he goes through his checkoff list for the procedure. First, he prepared his engine for the recovery, adjusting his fuel mixture and supercharger to accept the richer air at sea level. He's preparing his plane. He's at 20,000 feet. He's preparing his plane, his machine, so that it can operate at sea level. He's going to be there in less than 2 minutes once he initiates his dive. So he prepares his engine. For the change in air pressure, he also prepares it for the stress of the dive. So he sets his propeller speed to maximum and closes his cowl flaps and oil cooler scoop. The final item on the list was the dive flaps. With his right hand, he set their selector to the open position. And as the hydraulic pump opened the flaps above and beneath his wings, Kleiss took out his ephedrine spray, snorting it one nostril at a time. And this was a drug which cleared his nasal passages so that the rapid loss in pressure would not burst his eardrums. He stowed away the ephedrine and cracked open his canopy so that if he crashed, it would not jam shut. Then he rocked his wings from side to side, signaling to his wingman he's about to dive. Finally, pushing his control stick away, closing his Dauntless towards the sea, he enters the dive. Survive, he said to himself, survive. Well, the rectangle of the Kaga, as he looks down at the direction of where he's plunging, he sees the Kaga, the Japanese aircraft carrier, the Kaga, and he sees the rectangle of that deck sweeping clockwise. The rear half of the ship was in flames 50 feet high. which was probably the fire caused by the explosion of one of the earlier planes in his formation. From the incendiaries the pilot's name was Earl Gallagher, from incendiaries that he had dropped among fuel tanks on the deck of the Kaga. Yet the other half of the ship was untouched. Kleiss remembered that the bow, with a big red circle, it was intact. It was an enormous emblem of the rising sun, and Kleiss envisioned the position of that red sun in 40 seconds and aimed at that point. The aircraft artillery was more intense. It was exploding all about him as he dived. Black smoke blooming about the sky. Survive, Kleiss repeated, the wind rough on his face. He passed 10,000 feet, the red circle continuing to swing into position. His plane accelerated to 240 knots. His adjustments, the trim controls at his left elbow, the rudder pedals at his feet, the control stick, they were all minor. At this point in the dive, he's just making very, very slight adjustments so that he can make sure to hit the target. At 4,000 feet, he leaned forward, peering into the bomb sight and reaching for the release lever by his left knee. He passed 2,500 feet, the recommended release point, but he continued diving. He was so determined to secure a hit that he waited until he was at 1,500 feet above the ocean. And with his left hand, he moved the release lever to salvo, releasing his 500-pound general-purpose bomb. A second later, he released his two 100-pound incendiaries. Then he drew back the control stick and pulled up from his dive. Well, what Kleiss had dropped from his Dauntless, it was a metal container filled with 264 pounds of trinitrotoluene, also known as TNT. It was a cylindrical shape with an ogival nose. You can see the nose there, here in the diagram, and a four-fin tail. Looped through the nose was an arming wire, and as the container fell away from the plane, the wire was withdrawn, activating a vane at the tip of the nose. The vane spun in the wind, and immediately, because the speed exceeded 300 miles per hour, the gears on the vane sheared, causing the fuse to fully arm. 3 seconds later, it hit the deck of the Kaga. The upper portion of the fuse telescoped into the lower portion, forcing the firing pin into the primer. 1/100th of a second later, after the container had entered the hangar, the primer set off the detonator, which then exploded the TNT. In an instant, the TNT was transformed into a hot gas. The gas then expanded violently, sending out a shock wave in all directions. Recovering, Kleiss was so low that the ocean sprayed his windshield. Looking over his shoulder, he could see an explosion in progress on the big red circle, or rather a big one and a little one of greater intensity. The main bomb had hit the forward elevator and blown out all the windows on the bridge. The conflagration merged with the one Gallagher had started, the previous pilot in Kleiss's formation, so that the entire ship was a mass of flames 100 feet high. Well, the Dauntless pilots, they accomplished this violence with skill, delivering not so much a bomb as what was effectively a guided missile. 27 pilots attacked the Kaga and 4 scored hits. 3 attacked the Akagi and 1 scored a hit. 9 attacked the Soryu with 3 scoring hits. And together this amounted to an average success rate of about 21%. 1 in 5 bombs struck home. Within minutes, the ocean had been radically transformed. It was now dominated by 3 funeral pyres, with the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Akagi all belching smoke. And so inside the carrier hangars of the Japanese, there was plenty to burn. As I described with Nagumo's dilemma, there was quite a bit of ordnance which had accumulated in 2 of the 4 carriers, and in all of the carriers, there were planes which were fully fueled and stored there. And if you think about it, one Japanese torpedo bomber, just one aircraft alone holds about 180 gallons of fuel. Well, the blast from the American dive bombers, from the ordnance that they had delivered, it had also broken the fuel lines, and these broken lines steadily pumped fuel onto the deck of the. Without ventilation, the fumes and the unsecured ordnance lying around began to create a potent fuel-air bomb. Ammunition, as one Japanese explosive expert wrote, is an organic creature, which, however we make it, insists always upon its own independence, betraying sometimes our selfish expectations. The bombs and the torpedoes piled up across the hangar decks of the Kido Butai. They had been assembled with a view to attacking the Americans, and now they were about to demonstrate a mind of their own. This quotation about ordnance, it comes from a series of interviews that were conducted after the war, and it illustrates the way that what the Japanese had intended to use in their attack on the American fleet, it ended up being put to a very different purpose. One Japanese survivor recalled that the Kaga was an inferno with scorched, blackened men staggering around in helpless confusion. And on the Soryu, the pilot, Juzo Mori, said that pieces of airplane were flying through the air. A wall of flame was rushing towards him. Well, Dusty Kleiss, at this point, he's about 5 miles from the Kido Butai, and he turned for one final look over his shoulder and saw the carriers flaming, and these were his words, he saw them flaming like Kansas straw stacks. The fires in the Akagi were already shooting 300 feet high, and its steel was red hot. And then on the Kaga, Kleiss saw a catastrophic explosion that scooped out the forward part of the carrier. Its huge elevator was thrown into the air. Rockets of flame, pieces of steel bolted upwards to about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. Kleiss said it was like a Roman candle with fire shooting up into the air. The whole carrier was blanketed by smoke. Clarence Dickinson, he witnessed the same scene. I saw her blow up in the middle, he wrote, as a ball of solid fire shot straight up. The ball of fire passed through the fleecy lower clouds about 1,200 feet above the water and even higher. Some of this was powered by gasoline, but Dickinson, who was writing before the full story was known, thought the explosions were primarily caused by their own bombs, by the ordnance of the Japanese, parked below on the hangar decks in readiness for planes to be rearmed. Well, the Japanese carriers burn and then they're sunk by their own side because they're beyond repair. The Soryu and the Kaga are brought down just after 1900 on 4 June, after 7 p.m. at night, and the Akagi and the Hiryu sink early the next morning. The result was decisive. And this decisive result is perhaps why the Battle of Midway has been the subject of many historical accounts and also 2 major films, first in 1976 and then in 2019. The legacy of the battle, it's very important, and it's something we can discuss more during the Q&A if you like. And this is the other work by Alvin Kernan. He was an ordnanceman on the Enterprise, and who also presents a very important perspective on the battle. And what I think is unique, though, for our account, what we really bring to the fore is that more than any other, it's the value of the SBD that brings about the American victory. Shortly after the battle, Admiral Nimitz, he sent a private telegram to Heineman. "Thanks for building the SBD," he said. "It saved us at Midway." The plane and Heineman's contribution that were recognized by the admiral, who was willing to meet the Japanese at Midway Atoll. The Office of War Information, when reviewing the battle, stated simply that the Navy's carrier-based standard dive bomber, the Dauntless, it was the best in the world in its category. But this was only half the story. The other half was that the Dauntless was ready in quantities on the decks of our carriers and on our Navy flying personnel. Our Navy flying personnel was thoroughly trained in its handling when we entered the war. So in other words, what the Office of War Information is recognizing there is that it was peacetime procurement that had enabled the United States to turn the tide in the Pacific War. And this truth about the Dauntless was recognized by the pilots themselves. Kleiss, he later wrote, "Our planes were the newest, most accurate of naval weapons, the only ones capable of sinking a fast-moving, swirling ship." And he believed that credit for the victory at Midway should go not merely to the pilots, but to the designers and the builders of the Dauntless as well. Our nation, he insisted, it owes a great debt to Ed Heineman and his brilliant team at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in El Segundo, California.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.